Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. Hi guys, welcome to the Haunted Valley. Today we are going to start discussing The Shining, which was published in 1977, and I'm using the Signet paperback for this. Part 1 is called Prefatory Matters, and Chapter 1 is Job Interview. So the very first line is, quote, Jack Torrance thought, officious little prick, page 15. And I don't know about you, but I love that opening line. I love everything about it, and I have often found myself thinking that or muttering it under my breath randomly. So it has definitely stuck with me. So the officious little prick is Stuart Ullman, and he is the person in charge of the Overlook Hotel. And he is in charge of giving Jack a job, even though the job has basically been lined up for him by his friend. His friend, Al Shockley, he is part of a board of trustees, so he kind of has say over who gets a job at the Overlook, and Stuart Ullman kind of puts Jack through his paces because he wants to be the one to say, yes, I hire you, that kind of thing. So it's not really a question of whether Jack is going to get the job, it's just what is Stuart Ullman going to do to make Jack feel undeserving of the job or uncomfortable. He wants to be in charge. He wants to make the decision, even though basically the decision has already been made. The Overlook Hotel is so fascinating to me. I would love to see a book about its history, maybe an anthology of short stories about things that happened in the rooms. Like, I see a lot of potential. I could see there are 110 rooms in the hotel, so I would like to see several stories of what has happened in room 135, that kind of thing. And I think that a lot could be done with it. The backstory given in here is so rich and developed, and yet it is just scratching the surface. I feel like if Stephen King really wanted to, he could just milk the Overlook for just everything it's worth. So the Overlook, it has 110 rooms. We start at the top with an attic, then the third floor has 30 suites, the second floor has 40 rooms, the first floor has 40 rooms, then there's the lobby, and then underneath is the basement. So it's a huge hotel. If you don't know the backstory, it's a hotel in Colorado that is seasonal. It is only open from the 15th of May through the 30th of September. And then for the rest of that time it closes because the elevation and the mountain roads make it impossible to safely stay open, because keeping those roads clear would be almost impossible. The amount of snow, and all the telephone lines are above ground, and they always at some point go down because of the storms and snow, all that stuff. So the very concept is so interesting. It's a huge hotel. It's only open for a small portion of the year, basically, and the rest of the time someone has to stay in the hotel to keep up with maintenance to make it not such a loss, because once winter sets in, if no one is there at all, there are going to be problems that crop up that won't get attended to until next spring, and that is just going to be more trouble than it's worth, more money than it's worth. So if you have someone there who can heat the place and keep it at a nice low temperature, you can have someone who can repair things as they break and they're not sitting for a long time. You have someone to keep an eye on things so that like a pipe doesn't burst and flood the hotel, that kind of thing. So the concept of having a hotel to yourself is very intriguing and appealing, but then there's the isolation factor, which would freak me out because getting to Sidewinder, I think it's 30 miles away. That's the nearest town. And I would be very concerned. You know, if someone's bleeding out because of some accident, you're not going to get them help in time. And that would give me pause. But Jack is going to move in with his wife, Wendy, and his son, Danny. So the three of them are going to live in this hotel for months. And that just, I don't know, it was more appealing to me when I was a teenager reading this book. But now as an adult, I think about all the terrible things that could happen, and it makes me really nervous. So while Ullman is kind of grilling Jack Torrance, he mentions, quote, "During our first winter, I hired a family instead of a single man. There was a tragedy, a horrible tragedy." This is on page 19. And the tragedy that he's speaking of is that Delbert Grady, the caretaker he hired, killed his two little girls and his wife, and then killed himself. So he chopped up his daughters with a hatchet, and he shot his wife with a shotgun, then he turned the shotgun on himself and died. And in the movie, the wife isn't really mentioned. It's, you know, obviously it's the little girls that are focused on, and then Delbert Grady, he's in the movie too, but the wife is kind of ignored. So part of the problem is that Jack Torrance is a recovering alcoholic. So he went through a bad time in Stovington, Vermont. That's where they're from. And he reached rock bottom with his drinking, with something bad that happened while he was drinking. And he and Al Shockley were basically drinking buddies. They partied a lot. They thought they were silly and funny, and everyone else started thinking they were jerks and not amusing at all, just drunks. So Ullman puts Jack through his paces, ends up hiring him, as we knew he would, because otherwise there wouldn't be a story. And chapter 2 is Boulder, and this explains a little bit more of why Danny, Wendy, and Jack are now in Colorado. And there was an incident at the school that Jack worked at where he flew into a rage when a kid let out the air in his tires, and he beat the kid up, and that got him, I think it was a forced resignation more than anything. And he then, needed money. He couldn't pay his mortgage, that kind of thing, so they ended up moving out west where he's going to have this caretaking job. So Wendy and Danny are kind of in this rundown apartment complex, and Wendy is thinking about all the bad things that had happened. They are living in Boulder, Colorado on Arapahoe Street, and if I'm not mistaken, Arapahoe Street is also mentioned in The Stand. We are introduced to Danny and to Wendy, and I really like the character of Danny, and I am not a kid person, but the way that Stephen King writes kids is, I don't know. I don't mind them. I actually kind of like them. So Danny would be an example, and Charlie from Firestarter. I really like Charlie. And part of it could be because they are so adult in their thinking and their actions, and they aren't like kids in a way. But anyway, I really like Danny. I like Wendy, but I feel bad for her. She's kind of trapped. She has a mother who is very overbearing, very domineering, which is a big theme in Stephen King's work. There's a lot of mother-daughter relationship stuff where the mom is very domineering. There's a lot of tension. The mother and daughter don't always see eye to eye or get along. And I mean, we saw that with Carrie and her mom. We saw that with Susan and her mom. We're seeing it with Wendy and her mom. So it is a theme. There will be others coming to fit that theme. Chapter 3 is Watson, and he is the caretaker of the Overlook during the normal season. He's the maintenance guy. And he shows Jack the boiler and shows him how he's going to work things. And Jack is supposed to check the boiler 3 times a day and dump the steam if it gets too high. So if the pressure is too high, Jack has to dump off the steam, otherwise the boiler could explode. So that's why he has to check it so frequently. And Watson says, quote, "You couldn't get me to come down and stand next to her when that dial was up to 180. That's on page 32. There is no automatic shutoff to the boiler. And I just don't think I would like that job. I mean, what if you forget? What if it creeps up past its normal boiling pressure acceptability and explodes within minutes? Because, I don't know, there's just a whole bunch of problems that I would have as a cautious, nervous person. So also in this chapter, we find out that Jack broke Danny's arm when he was drinking one night. And this would have been 2 years ago. Danny had messed up his office. He had pulled out drawers and dumped things, spilled beer on the desk, and there were just, it was horrible. And Jack went to pull him away, and he was angry, and he was drunk, and he used a lot of force. And he ended up breaking Danny's arm. Wendy almost left him over that, and that caused a lot of tension. And that was one of the factors for why there's this major division between Wendy and Jack. It's kind of like a fallback. Like, she could always be mad at him for that. It even said that she looked at him and hated him in that moment. And so Jack is always feeling like that's going to be thrown in his face. Wendy can throw that in his face. And poor Danny, he just wants to please his dad. He loves his dad. He is a daddy's boy for sure. And while Watson and Jack are down in the basement, Jack sees just tons of paperwork, receipts, bills, just newspaper stuff, a whole accumulation of junk that is very intriguing because it is basically the history of the hotel. You know, a little paper trail of the history of the hotel. And they're talking about the hotel and things that have happened there. And Watson says, quote, "Any big hotels have got scandals, just like every big hotel has got a ghost." That's on page 34. And that sets up for, you know, another reason why I think that Stephen King could just write a huge book about the Overlook. I have many ideas about this, guys. I would love to see like a coffee table book and like a huge encyclopedia. I don't know, maybe I should try and contact him and ask if I could do that for him. Chapter 4 is Shadowland. Danny is special in that he can reach out with his mind and see things. He can tap into people's feelings, and he can see what they're thinking sometimes. And he has honed this skill on his own. He has a friend named Tony who comes and he shows him things. He shows him visions. And to me, for some reason, this is like the precursor to Ellie and Pascal, even though Pascal was a spirit that comes to Ellie. There are a lot of similarities between Danny and Ellie. I think it's way more developed in Danny than in Ellie. I'm talking about Pet Sematary, by the way. And they're talking about Danny's power. Quote, "He understood a great many things about his parents, and he knew that many times they didn't like his understandings, and many other times refused to believe them. But someday they would have to believe. He was content to wait." That's on page 38. So Danny helped, he can help find missing things. Like one time the movers misplaced Jack's trunk that had his manuscript in it, and Tony showed Danny that the trunk was actually under the stairs. So he was able to tell Jack, without having gone down there himself, that, you know, this is where your stuff is. Look here. And there it was. And during the time when his arm was broken and Wendy was so angry at Jack, and Jack just kept drinking and hanging out with Al Shockley and, you know, basically being a terrible father, she was often thinking about divorcing him. And Danny could pick up on this divorce thought. And Danny calls drinking, Jack's drinking, the bad thing. And he thinks of divorce, which he capitalizes the whole word, as, quote, the greatest terror of Danny's life. So to Danny, divorce would be horrible. He wants his parents happy, he wants them together. They have that potential, so he just wants them to have a cohesive family. And Jack's drinking, which is the bad thing. The bad thing is what's going to lead to divorce, and Danny doesn't like that. So while Jack is doing his job interview stuff, Danny waits for him on the curb outside of their apartment, and he is kind of trying to reach out to Jack and touch his thoughts and see what has happened, because Wendy is nervous about all these things, like maybe he didn't get the job, maybe he did get the job, but maybe I don't want him to have that job. What if the car breaks down? All this stuff, you know, just typical things that people worry about. And Danny can tap into that. He understands. So he is trying to tap into Jack's thoughts so that he can be reassured that everything is fine. So he reaches out for Jack's thoughts. Tony appears and shows him all these terrible images. He shows him a snowstorm, a hotel with a poison symbol flashing across the front of it in green lights, a collection of warning signs, a dark shape with a mallet swinging at walls, a bloody hand that's hanging over the side of a bathtub and dripping blood, and then he sees red rum, and he has no idea what that is, but he's afraid of that. He's very afraid of it. So if you've seen the movie, you pretty much understand what all this imagery is leading to. Chapter 5 is Phonebooth, and it's kind of talking about the history of Al and Jack's friendship and their being alcoholics together, and what happened to make them both quit drinking was they were driving one night, they were drunk, both of them were drunk, and there was a bicycle in the middle of the road, and Al was going way too fast around the curve to avoid it. He hit it, flew into the air. They spent hours looking for a body because they couldn't imagine that a bike would just be parked in the middle of the road without someone on it or near it, and they never found one. And it scared them enough that they decided they had to stop. So Wendy almost left him during this time, and Jack decides to sober up and to just stop. And he tells Wendy, because she is about to approach him for a divorce. She's about to ask him for a divorce, and he tells her, please, let's not say anything for, you know, a week, and then we can talk about it later. And he cleans up his act, and that's that. So basically in this chapter, he's calling Al to thank him for the job at the Overlook. Chapter 6 is Night Thoughts, and this chapter is about Wendy and her relationship with Jack and how they met and how she has issues with her mom. She can't do anything right, which is one of the reasons why she stays with Jack. One of the reasons she stayed with Jack. It's not, she does love Jack and she does want the relationship to work, but when they were having that really bad patch and she almost left him, part of what kept her from leaving him was that she couldn't do it on her own and she would have to crawl back to her mom, and Jack is a better alternative to her mother, even as a drunk who's not really, you know, helping her out in any way. Talking about Danny, quote, he loved his mother, but he was his father's boy. And that's on page 66. And that just goes to show that Wendy dotes on him, Jack dotes on him, but Danny just, he'll do anything to please his dad. Wendy, while she's laying there thinking about things, quote, She felt that the three of them had been permanently welded together, that if their 3/oneness was to be destroyed, it would not be destroyed by any of them, but from outside, on page 66, which is kind of a foreshadowing of, the fact that they are a strong unit together, but outside factors will destroy them. Chapter 7 is in another bedroom, and in this chapter Danny is looking for Tony. It's dark, he's up very late, and it has some very good imagery, and like I've said, I really enjoy the character of Danny. He's very likable, and I find the whole Tony thing very intriguing. So that is the end of part 1, and I love how it immediately gives you some backstory on the Overlook, but it doesn't even scratch the surface about what we're going to find out. And I love that the Overlook is kind of a character in the same way that I feel like the Marston House was a character in the book, but the Overlook is way more fleshed out. I also really like Jack. He is a very flawed character. He's very prideful. He obviously has issues with alcohol, and he broke his kid's arm. But I think what really helps is that Danny loves Jack so much that we are more forgiving. So even though Jack does all this stuff, I actually find him to be a likable character all the way through the book. And I don't think that's necessarily typical. Wendy and Danny both love Jack. They see the good in him. It's more that he's a good guy, but external factors bring out the bad parts. He's not a character who's just naturally bad. He is a good man who struggles very hard against demons and external things that are out of his control for some of it. So I really like that Jack, Wendy, and Danny are all likable characters. You root for them, you want good things for them, you want their little family unit to succeed. So that is the end of part 1. We will do part 2 next week. Have a spooky day.